Okay, thank you so much for those two wonderful papers. I was trying to figure out a way of easily summarizing the points of connection between the two, but they are completely interwoven. A woman and her sister and family who lived out their lives on a small but beautiful rock off the coast of Kerry. In her work, I mean, obviously, when you focus so hard on a scientific pursuit, it turns into an act of prayer. And I think there's a common denominator there, and also a common denominator in the sense of adventure. The world is out there to be explored and understood and rejoiced in all of its colour and dimension, contradictions and beauty. And I think that these two papers have captured that very well. I'd like to open them up to the floor for questions or any discussion that anyone would like to make an observation. So if anybody would like to start the ball rolling. You've wowed them into silence. Yes, Pick.
This comment, rather than anything enlightening or so, it relates to hidden stuff. And this is, in 1949, there was a very famous expedition to Ireland by an international botanical group. Professors, the leading professors from all over Europe came here, and there's a very famous photograph of them taken in front of the aula here. And actually my colleague, my former colleague, because I'm retired here, Micheline Sheehy Skeffington, she, a few years ago, I admitted to her that I showed her this photograph, and she said to me, "How could you? You will ruin the minds of these young students." And I think what she was getting at was the fact that these were all men, totally men, in ties. They hadn't their field gear on. They were all field botanists, actually. But I happened to be 2 years ago in Innsbruck, and one of the participants was the Professor Gams from Innsbruck, was in this group. And somebody said to me, "Oh, we have photographs here relating to this expedition to Ireland, 1949. Oh, I said, "I'd love to see them." And sure enough, photographs appeared out, and more or less the same photograph as I know pretty well, Tim Collins has published it, of the, has republished it probably, of the group in front. And there was a woman, a single woman. I said, "Oh my God, what has happened? You know, is there some Stalinist thing?" And sure enough, I examined a little more carefully, and of course it was the Maureen de Valera, who subsequently became professor of botany, the first professor of botany in NUI Galway. She was then an assistant. So she appeared, she was in this informal group, but the formal group was something totally different. So I thought that, you know, it shows an aspect of hiddenness. I know this is a little bit extraneous with this whole thing, but I thought it might be of interest to people here, especially who are in NUI Galway, and to the associations with here, and of course associations with Connemara, and indeed all of Ireland, because this group went to all of Ireland.
I think it's a very well made point. I mean, we discussed this a little bit last year when John was visiting Galway, and I kind of gave a very small version of what I kind of developed today out there. And John, we talked about kind of, I suppose, the role of men and women in terms of kind of a development of ecology, of nature writing, and of science as well. And Rachel Carson was the person that you mentioned in particular. So I think it's a very interesting point, and a lot of women and other forms of field workers, whether local people, that they get written out of it as well. And so that was so interesting about Maud, that she was seeking to professionalise it in a particular way, but also for the museum to pay people to collect the specimens so they could afford to pack it up and send it on the train up to Dublin. You know, so it is a very interesting aspect. It's interesting.
That's great. Work. If I could just bounce off Nessa's comment about Rachel Carson, it's interesting that strangeness is a way to perceive with fresh eyes, And women, so long held out of the scientific dialogue as out of many other dialogues as they have entered in, have seen so many things that people were not seeing before. So they were hidden, and they were able to perceive things that were hidden. And Rachel Carson is a great case in point. When she noticed the way in which DDT was carried throughout the organic waves of life, including human life, all over the United States, she was regularly lampooned and criticized as a woman, speaking where she shouldn't be. And people said things like, well, you know, you're a woman, you shouldn't be in the conversation, or you have no children, why should you worry about the future? I mean, people were incredibly abusive of her and prejudicial in the way they did it. But meanwhile, she's seeing something they didn't. And just talking with somebody last night about Jane Goodall, all the early important, this late wave of primatologists have been women. Every single one of them in the first five that opened this new field. And they tended to do things like attribute individual personalities to the great apes, which the basic scientific community really didn't like at all. And to give them names even. But increasingly, as the research goes on, we find that the language and personalities of the apes can really be distinguished from chimpanzees. So the hidden, the people who've been hidden or suppressed often then are able to see things that weren't on an angle of vision others were following.
Thank you.
Yeah, the scientific community has a proud tradition of overlooking the obvious, doesn't it, really, in a lot of cases? Does anybody else like to make a comment or build on that or change the direction of the conversation? Dan?
A question for you both. I mean, to what extent do you think it helps to think of Tim Robinson as a travel writer? Is that something that informs his mode of composition and relationship to what he's describing?
Okay. The question, sorry, for those of you at the back who may not have heard from Dan Carey, is to what extent is the work of Tim Robinson to be characterized as that of a travel writer? Did I hear you correctly? Thank you, Dan.
If I can paraphrase Jane, I think at one point we had this conversation and she said, well, what's interesting about Tim is that they stayed. And I think it's interesting about moving across and throughout landscape. I think kind of there's a key concept. Somebody this morning, I think it was John Wiley, actually mentioned the idea of the adequate step. And the importance of that, but also the idea of roots, I think, are very important, not just as something that grows into the ground, but a different root way across. So I think it's kind of what you were saying as well, John, in many ways, that it's about that there's a problematic there, there's a relationship that's there with the landscape, but how you negotiate, how you relate to that, that's very evident in Tim's work. And I think it's a lesson for people that would see themselves as being native of the West or native of Ireland in many ways, to review and to reinterpret their own landscape in a very different way. So I think it offers a different way of looking at it in that sense.
That's very well said, and I would just another angle might be I think Tim Robinson is a travel writer who's been on this trip for 40 years or so at the moment. It's a long trip, not just a summer vacation, and the 2 points there: to be a travel writer is to be in a place that strikes you in some ways as remarkable. It's not habitual, familiar, and therefore you're at a level of alertness that is unusual as well. But to go to a place, and this is where I wouldn't describe him as a travel writer, to go to a place and live there over the seasons of your life, and to see winter after winter and see what they have in common, or to watch the turning from winter to spring and see what's up there, to put together a story from one perhaps elderly neighbor here, and then several years later to hear the end of the verse or another version from another one, is to go beyond the strangeness of travel. I think is enlivening for a writer, but it can also be superficial, and this has that sense of strangeness and discovery, but going down into such remarkable depth that the people. I'm not sure whether the citizens of countries to which travel writers journey often want to read their books. But in Tim Robinson's case, it's clear that people living in Western Ireland have been, and who've been here all their lives, have been greatly enriched by them. That's the other side.
I mean, if I could add as a coda onto that, I mean, I think what's also a value of people like Tim and other writers kind of writing in a similar vein is often they might see things that we might rather not look at. I mean, there is that uncomfortableness that happens every now and then as well, where they see there is that strangeness, there is that difference, and that they're attuned to a different way of registering and articulating the landscape in a different mode that might not have been articulated otherwise. So I think it offers us a different lens on that in a way that's valuable for us all, I think.
Maybe if I could jump in there, Tim, it must seem rather odd to be talked about in the third person, so you'll have to forgive us for doing that, but it's but I think you've made an enormous contribution to public awareness of the fact that places just keep giving, and that it doesn't matter. You can live in the one place and be sustained fully, and the places have such historical depth in Ireland and such cultural depth, as they do all over the world. But I think your exploration of that has demonstrated to people that travel writing is, in fact, in some ways, at a bit of a crossroads, if there's no pun there. But there's a huge, huge market in travel writing all over again. One of the speakers yesterday, for example, a Finnish woman living in Vancouver, has a travel blog, which, believe it or not, is the most widely read blog in the world. She has 8 million followers. And I was struck by the fact that, you know, there's a little bit of cherry picking in this, kind of hopping around from place to place. And I think that there's an audience out there who wants to visit the world, can do so vicariously now more easily than ever before, but by the same token is frustrated by the fact of the sure knowledge that's stopping somewhere, giving it time, allowing it to talk, is actually where the true gain will occur.
Can I build on that, Connor, your point? We're having a nice conversation up here. I think there's an angle on this I'd like to just express, and I've spoken to it in other contexts. I live in Vermont, which is a green and beautiful place, an old-fashioned place at the edge of another country. And and I didn't address this at all in what I said today, but one of the great values of Tim for me is not just that he's opened the door to Connemara for me. People who were born here had a context in which his books fell like a catalyst, and I read a book that fascinated me and made me want to walk through that door. But he's also spoken to my place where I was living. I think that, and I'm sure this could be true in many ways, but for me it was living in a beautiful place that's considered old-fashioned and kind of a 19th century legacy, but which could also equally, and perhaps more importantly, be viewed as a wounded and recovering landscape, whose beauty is related to its loss. So I found that it not only enriched my world through giving me a place I didn't know before in some way, but it gave me my home. And I think the world is full of people who love marginal, beautiful places, living in a literature and a culture that wants to give it all to the capital.
If I could just finally add on that, and we will stop, probably promise, is I think as well what's unusual in many ways as well about a lot of this work is that there's such a sensitivity to the Irish language and to honouring the place, but also honouring the people in the place as well. And many years ago we had an event out in Roundstone where a very well-known Shannon singer in residence, Micheál Cuig, stood up and he was going to sing Captain Moylach. Tim had been writing a chapter from Connemara, one of the volumes of the trilogy on Captain Moylach at the time, and halfway through Micheál kind of inadvertently forgot the lyrics, but who was the person in the hall that remembers them? It was Tim Robinson. So there's another way of how stewardship of the land and of care of the land can I suppose be recovered, but also can be sustained by different people in different ways, and I think that's a very valuable lesson for us all.
Lovely. Well, one of the great qualities, I think, of landscape is the capacity, kind of an intrinsic capacity to make itself available over and over again. So things that are forgotten can actually be rediscovered, you know. So it's not all what can be maintained. And again, I'm speaking, I suppose, from the perspective of an archaeologist, but one of the things I've experienced now over the last couple of years throughout the country, wearing the Heritage Council hat, is that communities all over Ireland are trying to repair themselves, trying to recover and self-heal following the damaged place that was inflicted during the so-called Celtic Tiger years. And more of them are finding a starting point on that journey is place, is heritage of place. It's the common ground. It's not that they've all suddenly converted over to heritage. They're interested in job creation and community building and so on and so forth. But the common point for all of them, starting point, is place, a celebration of place. And that's something that I think actually as a society we need to wake up to the fact that that is happening around us and support people in their efforts to do that, because it is arising spontaneously all over the countryside. We might take it in a different direction. If somebody wants to take up on that, by all means do, but if you've got some other observation or perspective, and we'll probably talk for another 5 minutes. Michael, do you want to come back in again? Just hold on a second, we'll get the microphone to you.
I'm saying, dare I come back again just to say on Valentia Island, of course, it is a massive topic. But I suppose I'm wearing slightly a Royal Irish Academy hat, maybe partly, that in that Frank Mitchell, of course, he has written a book on the Valentia Island, very much from, I think, a landscape perspective, because he was a landscape person. And I think maybe that kind of, Frank Mitchell, for anybody might know, he was president of the Royal Irish Academy for a time. And I think actually, indeed, Trinity College owned part of Valentia Island, I think, as well. So, you know, but thanks for the lovely lecture hinging on that.
Hear, hear. And Frank Mitchell was a wonderful man, an inspiration to so many of us. And if ever, I'm sure there's people here in the audience who got a postcard from him. He used to do his own watercolours, and his postcard that he would send to people was of a shop front, an old Irish shop front, where written across the window, I would say the name of the shop was F.M. Mitchell, and across the window was Landscapes, a speciality. I have one. It's one of my most treasured possessions. This lady at the front.
I would just like to say that I know Tim for a great number of years and was lucky enough to roll his bicycle into a shed in Lisdoonvarna about 40 years ago. But the papers we have had today have been absolutely most interesting, have developed points that I never really thought about landscape at all, and gave those places so much more interest. But the thing about the Burren map, with which I'm very familiar because I live there, Tim's map dignified tiny little coves, tiny little rocks, gave them a history, gave them an interest that the local people who had lived for many generations in that cove never knew anything about. And it has given wonderful interest for visitors who, you can go from A to Z on Tim's map. You can start with archaeology, botany, conchology, dendrology, etymology, history, lepidoptery. Go right back down to Z. And Tim's folding landscapes and folding books are all there for you to read. And thank you, Tim. Thank you, Mairead. You've given us a wonderful time.
I cannot think of a more suitable way to end the discussion, and I absolutely love your use of the word dignified. That to dignify the landscape is dignifying ourselves. So thank you very much. We'll now break. I'd like you to join with me finally in thanking the two speakers from this afternoon's session, and then I think Dan Kerry would like to say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, Conor. Just to reiterate what Conor was saying, the next thing that's happening in this space is the screening of the film Unfolding the Landscape. This is where Tim is in conversation with Vincent Woods and also with Nicolas Fèvre. So you're very welcome to stay for that. I wanted to thank you for your attendance at the papers today. I think in many ways this image is highly appropriate. We've been anchored to the landscape through language, through interpretation today. I want to thank Jane Conroy once again for putting together a wonderful event. Thank you.